pilots do it, why not drivers? That's the question we'll ask this week on Motoring 97.
TSN's Motoring 97 is brought to you by Quaker State. The big Q stands for quality. Always has, always will. And Midas, the way it should be.
So what do tractors have in common with jet planes, you ask? Well, absolutely nothing. But stick around, because later in the program, I'll show you why these tractors and those pickup trucks have a lot in common. But first, back to the jets. Now picture this. You're getting on board a commercial aircraft and you notice this sign above the pilot flight deck that reads, Pilot Trainee. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm getting off and waiting for the next flight. Now, of course, this would never happen at an airport. So the question is this week, why should it be any different when driving an automobile? Before an airline pilot is allowed to take to the skies with or without passengers on board, he or she has already logged hundreds of hours of flight time in a simulator.
The simulators are so real that we do the entire training in this room, in this building, and qualify on type. That is, the Ministry of Transport come in on the last session and qualify the pilots, sign their licenses, and from that point on, we are qualified to fly a real aircraft for the first time with you as a passenger. That's the first time we've seen the aircraft, literally. And then we come back every 6 months for a 2-day course where we literally cover the entire course over a year.
Peter Cuttsy is a 30-year veteran with Air Canada, and he believes there's absolutely no reason why simulator technology cannot be used for driver education.
I sure do, and I feel much safer in an aircraft. That's why I think the importance for drivers to be introduced to driving in a simulated world first, so they can appreciate the real world when they get to it.
North American Van Lines has joined the real world with this mobile driver simulator. A group led by Guiding Lights Technology recently brought the simulator to Canada to demonstrate that simulation is now ready for driver training. The simulator costs $300,000, but Guiding Lights believes it's a bargain when you consider that over 1,100 motorists die each year in Ontario alone, costing taxpayers over $9 billion.
A study that was done by North American Van Lines using this very simulator over 3 years showed that drivers that had some training on a simulator had a 22% less accident rate than drivers trained in the same program but with no simulation. So what we took was a 3% factor to be very conservative, and based on those figures, 3% would save 33 lives a year. It would save $270 million a year of $9 billion, and that's what we're hoping to get the government interested in. Not only saves lives, but it cuts costs which the taxpayer pays for.
And it goes immediately to an overhead view. I've spent about 3-4 years on the road, held several operating positions at North American Van Lines, and got involved in driver training in 1983, as a matter of fact. We can go in and set up the environment. We can set up traffic aggressiveness, traffic density, visibility, either clear or the availability to roll fog in on the driver. And we can throw in mechanical failures such as oil pressure drop, brake pressure loss, tire pressure loss, overheat the engine. One of the things that is an advantage with simulation technology is that you can have an objective measure of the driver's performance. You're still not ignoring the human factor, and you still need instructors, and we're not using it as a substitute for training or driving in a real truck. But it's just an additional tool in the trainer's bag of tricks. Okay, here comes the emerging car. Oh, this time I didn't react quick enough and I hit him on the tail end.
I have 3 young boys, and there's going to come a time where they're going to have to learn how to drive. And if I have a choice of either bringing them out and giving them the car keys and teaching them myself, or taking them to a simulator, the choice is very clear. I will take them to the simulator every day because I see the results of that in my career, and I see what happens with proper training.
Oh well, call a wrecker.
Up next, mano a mano, as Ford and GM go head to head. When Ford introduced this 1997 Expedition, they made no bones about the fact that they wanted to take on GM's corporate twins, the Tahoe and Yukon. Well, this week on Test Drive, we're going to run the two head-to-head and find out who rules the roost. One of the dangers in doing head-to-head comparisons is that invariably there is never a clear winner. Now, this was not the case in our mini matchup. In terms of the suspension, the Expedition uses a double wishbone design with coil springs up front and a 5-link system with coils in back. Both ends benefit from large sway bars. On road, the ride is compliant, and despite the enormity of height, body roll is relatively mild. The Yukon differs in that it uses front torsion bars and rear leaf springs. While the Yukon's ride is comfortable, you always are aware of the leaf springs. Simply put, they're not as good as absorbing small road imperfections and tend to lose a little of their composure on washboard-type pavement. Chalk this one up to the Expedition. Off-road, there is little difference in capability, although the superior ground clearance offered by the Ford is an advantage. The single biggest difference between these two sport utility vehicles is found in the four-wheel drive systems. The Expedition's is full-time, meaning you can put it into four-wheel drive at the end of October and leave it there until the end of March. The Yukon's, on the other hand, you cannot, because you are not allowed to drive it on dry pavement. So picture this scenario. You go herring around a corner and headlong into the world's worst winter storm. The Expedition, it's already in four-wheel drive and ready to save your bacon. This vehicle, the driver has to think about it, select four-wheel drive, and by that time it could be too late. In the engine department, it was close. The Yukon's 5.7-litre V8 is both silky smooth and exceptionally brawny at the same time. With 255 horsepower and 330 pounds-feet of torque on tap, power is never an issue. The Expedition comes with a base 4.6-litre V8. Not bad as a car engine, but underdone for this particular application. The optional 5.4-litre V8 and its 230 horses and 325 pounds-feet of torque puts it on a better footing. That said, the Yukon takes the honours under the hood simply because the numbers are greater and every ounce of power turns up for work at much lower RPMs. Now, this is very important in this market. Both vehicles come with superb 4-speed automatics, meaning a saw-off. One of the options that I really like on this Expedition is the turn signal in the mirror. From the driver's seat, it's invisible. However, from the outside, it's clearly visible. Now, if only we could teach people to use the turn signal, this would be a really great option. Both of these behemoths come with standard anti-lock brakes. The advantage enjoyed by the Expedition is that the system works on discs at all four corners. The Yukon relies upon a disc drum setup. In terms of out-and-out stoppability, there is little to separate the two because both required less than 121 feet to stop from 80k. That said, the pedal feel afforded by the Yukon is marginally better, meaning it is easier to modulate. The Expedition comes one way, and that's loaded, especially if you go with the Eddie Bauer package. To start with, a 6-pack CD player where you can actually reach it without getting out of the driver's seat, fully functional overhead trip computer, a great sounding radio that sits above the climate controls, and it also comes with a real knob for volume, a full set of analog gauges. Elsewhere, power windows, locks and mirrors, cruise control, and of course a very comfortable 8-way power seat. The foibles, first of all, the overdrive light is so dim you can't tell whether it's on or off, which is liable to cost you a small fortune in fuel. It needs to be placed on the dash. The trip computer, well, it converts litres per 100 kilometres to US miles per gallon. Come on, Ford, we live in Canada. What about imperial gallons? So that's the Expedition. As far as the Yukon's concerned, it's pretty much of a saw-off between the two vehicles, primarily because GM have replaced the ergonomic nightmare they used to call a radio. It's now a user-friendly unit. It also comes with a single CD. Not quite as handy as the 6-pack, but it's still got a CD. When it comes to loading cargo, there's a difference between these two vehicles. On the Expedition, twist the handle one way, you can pop small stuff in through the back glass. Twist it the other way, and the tailgate lifts up out of the way. Perhaps the only drawback is the 17-inch tyres make the lift up quite high. On the Yukon, you've got to pump the remote, lift up the tailgate, and then drop the other half down. This means that anything that's up against the back seats, well, I think you get the picture. The advantage it has, however, it's not quite as high to lift stuff up. In terms of interior volume, the Expedition wins hands down with a maximum cargo capacity of 3,350 litres. That compares to 2,815 for the Yukon. The drawback comes with the fact that the expanded dimensions make the Expedition much more cumbersome in tight traffic. And forget about taking this monster underground. She ain't gonna go. Also, when it comes to the step-in height, you need a step ladder for the Eddie Bauer version of the Expedition. Access to the Yukon, on the other hand, is considerably better. On the safety front, both offer all they should, meaning neither one claims a victory in this regard. Two sets of keys, two very different vehicles. Which would I pick? Well, I know I'm going to disagree with the rest of the motoring crew, but I'd take the Expedition purely and simply because of its advanced all-wheel drive system.
Our Midas tip of the week concerns snow tires. A car that's a real handful in the wintertime can be transformed into a pretty capable performer just by the installation of a good set of snow tires. Now, if you're thinking of just installing two, I suggest you think again, because whenever you create a situation where you've got a huge discrepancy in traction between the front or rear of a vehicle, you're asking for problems. That's why most tire manufacturers recommend you install a set of 4 snow tires when you're installing them. A front-wheel drive car is a perfect example of what can go wrong. They're pretty capable on any all-season tire in the wintertime. You add snows to the front, and they're really good in straight line traction. But you try and stop or turn them, if you don't have good snow tires on the back, you're asking for trouble. Now, if you think it's going to be expensive, it is initially, but believe me, all those cars that you see towed away in the wintertime with bent suspensions, I'll guarantee you they're spending more to repair the suspension of that car than 4 snows will cost them. That's your Midas tip of the week.
A portion of Motoring 97 is brought to you by the Solder Seal Gunk family of automotive products, makers of Puncture Seal Gold and Liquid Wrench.
This highway runs north-south between Toronto and Collingwood, Ontario. I've traveled it many times myself, and like most other people, couldn't help but notice all these beautiful pickup trucks and wonder, what's it all about? Well, we're here to find out.
It's a lot of work. It takes a long time.
This story began in the 50s when Fred Lewis began a feed and supply business in Pickering, Ontario. He sold Honda motorcycles, washing machines, hardware, livestock feed, and Ford equipment and tractors. Then in 1975, the Trudeau government decided Pickering was a good place for an airport and began expropriating land that included Fred's business.
Well, as the auctioneer told, I asked him the night before what I was to do, and he said, "Oh, you'll laugh a little and you'll cry a little, and it'll come automatically," and so it did. There was 3 full-time auction rings. They started about 8:30 in the morning and run till about 9:30 at night. There was over 500 bidders. It was the biggest sale in history in that area.
The airport was never built, and it took 10 years and over $80,000 in legal fees before Fred received any money for his property. Fred, who was nearing his 75th birthday, is not one to sit still, so he began restoring used Ford tractors. And 15 years ago, the tractors were joined by Ford pickup trucks.
Well, they're all from the West. We attempted one Ontario truck several years ago, and it was a lost cause. They're so rusted. There's nothing wrong with Ontario. It's just the salt we use that causes the problem. They were so rusted that we patch, and when we're through, we have nothing to be proud of because we know the patches that are under the paint. So we'll get them all from the West where they didn't use salt. They're using a little bit now, but these trucks were retired before they started using salt. So it's just unbelievable. There's just no rust. I aim for 48 to 52. I just love those models. I have 2 or 3 or 4 53s, and I think I have a 56 out there yet. Well, it's a V8, Ford famous V8 flathead, very simple motor, 239 cubic inch. I think they were rated at 100 horsepower. I'm not sure how it's measured, but that's what the books say. The engines are mostly seized because they've set for quite a while, so we have to strip them right down, including taking the engine out, and we send it away and have it factory rebuilt. The tractors, those are good usable tractors that did come off probably 100-acre farms, but now there's very few 100-acre farms. Most of the farms have gone big, 2,000 and 3,000 and 5,000. So those tractors are not, I never sell to a farmer anymore. They are retired off the farm, but they're sold to doctors, lawyers, dentists, and undertakers, and playboys who come out of the big cities and buy a bit of country Canada, and they want a tractor. I'm not trying to do a commercial for Ford, but I think they're the most popular used or new truck in the world. They really have proven to be a real solid truck. And the very first truck I owned was a 1948 pickup. So I have a lot of respect and a lot of admiration for this model of truck.
On his many trips out west, Fred Lewis recently picked up this 1948 fire engine in La Riviere in southern Manitoba, population about 200. Now, the mileage on this, and get ready for this, 4,672 original miles. Why so low? Well, Fred asked the owner. He said, well, with a population of 200, if there was a fire more than 5 miles out of town, they stayed in the fire hall. And when was the last service? The last service was March 9th, 1960, had the oil changed. I wonder if it's ready for another oil change. Let's ask Bill.
Well, Brad, I'd say that truck's more than due for service. I'd say it's overdue. In any case, what we want to talk about this week is worn out CV joints. We've got a Buick LeSabre with a perfect example of a worn out CV joint. Now, I'm out in the parking lot doing some slow turns back and forth. I'm dragging my left foot slightly on the brake and applying just a little bit of throttle to put them under load. And when I crank it extreme left or right, you'll hear it. Listen. Now that knocking or clunking sound that you hear is coming out of the left outer CV joint. We're going to take it back to the shop, put it on the hoist, and you'll be able to see exactly what went wrong with it. Okay, now that we've got this Buick LeSabre back at the shop on the hoist, we can get a little bit closer look at what's going on with this CV joint. And there's different things that make these joints fail. This car is an 87 model, so it's about 9 years old, and it's got 200,000 kilometers on it. They can fail from high mileage or from physical damage or from just plain wear and tear. Now, in the case of this one, what happened was the protective boot around the outer CV joint got broken and cracked. It became open, and the grease got contaminated with grit and dirt, and it wore out the joint. The grease became sort of an abrasive compound. Now, you can see that as I turn the wheel out, that this boot has to flex an awful lot. And remember that it's turning as the wheel rotates, and all the propulsion for this left front wheel comes through that outer CV joint. It's cracked the boot open. There's still lots of grease in there. You can see the grease oozing around in there, but it's full of grit, so it's worn itself out. Now, if we go over to the bench, we can have a little bit closer look at a shaft out of another vehicle, very similar in configuration to this one, and get a little bit closer look at the parts involved. Okay, this shaft that we've got on the bench is out of a different vehicle. It happens to be out of a Dodge minivan, and each front-wheel drive vehicle would have 2 of these shafts, a left and a right, consisting of the inner CV joint, the boot, the shaft, the outer boot, and the outer CV joint. Now, the action in the car is this. The inner CV joint is splined into the transmission. The transmission's turning it, and it's what we call the plunge joint. It allows for the suspension travel, and it allows the shaft to change length a little bit. We call it the plunge joint, and you can see the plunging action in and out like this. Now, in the car, the shaft moves up and down with suspension travel and moves in and out slightly. Out at the wheel, it has to turn extreme left and right, so the action is like this when you steer the car. When you're going straight ahead, it's like this. When you go over a bump, it'll get this kind of an action here. Now, on this particular shaft, the problem was a worn inner CV joint. When we pull it apart, you can see it quite easily. Over here on this particular trunnion, there are no needle bearings between the trunnion and the outer part of the bearing. Over here, you can just see the ends of the needle bearings, and it's nice and tight on there. Now on this particular one, when those needle bearings crunched up and fell out of there, the shaft got off center and started wobbling like crazy. That's what our vibration problem was. If you happen to be lucky enough to notice a broken or leaking CV boot before you get the noise or vibration symptom, you can just change the boot, wash out the joint, and replace all the grease. It comes as what we call a boot kit. New boot, clamps, and grease. However, if you've got the noise or the vibration, it's too late for one or both of those joints, and you're going to have to install a reconditioned shaft. And nowadays, you can get a reconditioned shaft for most popular front-wheel drive cars for about $160 or $170 with both joints rebuilt, new boots, new grease, and ready to go in the car. And that's the procedure that most guys are following these days. Till next week, I'm Bill Gardner for Motoring 97.
What does your average truck driver have in common with Steve Neerlich and Jacques Villeneuve? I'll tell you next on Kenzie's Corner. Well, they're wrapping things up here at the Truck Driver Training Simulation Program, and it got me thinking about Steve Neerlich and Jacques Villeneuve. Who are these guys? Well, Villeneuve you know, but Steve Neerlich was the Canadian jet fighter pilot who won the Top Gun competition against the best American fighter pilots a few months ago. And Neerlich had never fired a real missile in his life. He'd done it all in simulation. And Villeneuve, well, the highlight of his sensational debut year in Formula One was setting pole position at Spa. Now, the Belgian circuit is the most difficult, fastest circuit on the whole Formula One calendar, and Villeneuve had never been there before. He'd learned the circuit on his video game simulator. We've seen that they can teach truck drivers and police officers with this technology. My question is, why not car drivers? I mean, if we could reduce the billions of dollars that car crashes cost us every year by just a couple of %, these things would pay for themselves in a heartbeat. And it's not just training new drivers, it's retraining. Why do we make an hour in a simulator like this a condition of renewing your license every 5 or maybe 10 years? I mean, that's what pilots do, but they're in a simulator every 6 months. Do you think there's a connection between the fact that we kill way few people in plane crashes than we do in car crashes to the fact that pilots are better trained than drivers? You better believe there is. The question isn't whether we can afford to use simulators, but whether we can afford not to use simulators. I'm Jim Kenzie.
Before we go, if you like the looks of Fred Lewis's 4 trucks earlier in the program, they go for about $15,000, and here's his phone number if you want to give him a call. It's 705-726-5883. Well, that's it for this week. We'll be back next week, though, as we continue to bring you more stories about cars and the people who drive them.
It's really a shame that they discontinued them at that time, and then other car manufacturers at the time that GM decided to discontinue these, other car manufacturers were just coming out with 2-seater sports cars, so they kind of missed the boat, I think.
TSN's Motoring 97 has been brought to you by Quaker State. The Big Q stands for quality, always has, always will. And Midas, the way it should be.